At the outset, a privileged few had full rights, while many others were forced to find their own pathways to equality. Then a wave of women stood their ground. Faced with many dead ends, they drove relentlessly along narrow roads and around uncharted bends, until at long last one group's great accomplishment led them straight away to better but still uneven and unequal days. A second wave made progress, but faced many obstacles and came up short of its goal. It's been a man's world for a long time, but maybe someday we'll be able to say that equally so, it's a woman's world. A show which looks at any and all topics under the sun from a woman's point of view, featuring Ali Naithani. Here's Ali.
Welcome to the show, and I'd like to say hello and welcome to my two co-hosts today. First of all, we have Bonnie Watkins with us, and Bonnie is a vice president with U.S. Women Connect.
Thanks,
welcome,
Ali.
Bonnie. Thanks for being here again.
Thank you.
All right. We also have Anu Murpala with us. Anu, welcome. Thank you for being with us again. You always are a wonderful contributor to our discussion, so we're so happy to have you with us.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
Excellent. All right. Well, welcome to you, and this is Ellen
Thank
Kennedy. Ellen, thank you so much for being with us today. Ellen is the Executive Director of World Without Genocide at William Mitchell College of Law.
It's a real pleasure to be here, Ali.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Well, you're back today because you recently came back from a human rights trip to Guatemala, and you're going to tell us all about that. And we're going to start off the discussion today with some photographs that you have.
Great. A lot of people are unaware of the fact that there was a genocide that was perpetrated in Guatemala. The tragedy lasted from 1960 until 1996. And I was fortunate to travel with this small group of very committed human rights advocates and activists for about 10 days. The group represented people from Mayflower Church in Minneapolis and Rachel Beecroft, who is the Program and Operations Coordinator at World Without Genocide. You see in this photo my husband, James Rodriguez, who is next to my husband, and then in the front, our driver as we traveled throughout Guatemala. Our agenda was to try to understand more about the tragedy that happened during that more than 3-decade period. What a lot of us don't realize is that an estimated 200,000 people perished and another 50,000 people were disappeared. And that means that they were taken away during the night or disappeared at some point from their villages, from their communities, and their whereabouts have never yet been determined. So what we were trying to do is to learn more so that we could come back, share information, and perhaps engage people in some advocacy to support important post-genocide issues. The area in this map that's circled indicates where we were traveling in Guatemala. And just as a refresher for people, Guatemala is only about a 3-hour flight from Miami. So it's very near to us, right on our doorstep, and a border, as you see, with El Salvador, Honduras, Belize, and Mexico. During the time of the conflict in Guatemala, there also was a great deal of political violence in Honduras and El Salvador as well. And it's estimated that up to 500,000 people in this region perished during that period. Now, what exactly was going on? If you think back to the 60s, 70s, and 80s, that was the Cold War. That was the time when the United States and our allies were fighting in political and economic ways against the influence of communism. And what was happening in a number of Latin American countries is that there were left-wing Marxist, pro-communist revolutions that were attempting to gain control for ordinary people, and that included indigenous groups as well. There were dictatorships, of course, that were using the strength of the government to try to subdue these left-wing rebellions. What this slide is illustrating is the communities that were being targeted and the number of massacres that were happening by department or by state, by area. And what I'd like you to notice is that the areas that are darkest in color are the places where the greatest number of massacres occurred. And that happened to be the primary areas that we were traveling so that we could understand this conflict a little better. What this is showing is the percent of massacres by department as well. And what you'll see is that the first two that are noted, Quiché and Huehuetenango, had by far the highest percent of massacres. I'm going to be speaking specifically about places that we visited where bodies were found, where memorials have been created, where groups have been established to try to discover what happened to their loved ones. Now, who was targeted? In Guatemala, people can be identified or self-identify in a couple of primary ways, most importantly as being members of indigenous Mayan communities or as being what are called Ladino or Mestizo, that is, having European ancestry and perhaps some mixed ancestry as well. And what this chart is showing is that the percentage of those who were victimized were 83% Mayan, 16% Ladino. So in large part, it was the indigenous people who were severely traumatized, who were targeted for extermination, who were the ones who were persecuted during this terrible 36-year period of genocide. Who then was responsible? This information was put together by a UN Commission for Historical Clarification. And what they have identified is that the government of Guatemala was responsible for 93% of the violence. So the government was exterminating its own people. This, of course, is what we saw in Cambodia. This is what we saw during the Holocaust when the German government was attempting to annihilate the Jews of Germany. This is a pattern that we see around the world when a government feels threatened and is persecuting its own people as a way to keep control. The very first day that we were there, we went to a site that was absolutely chilling. And it's a site, in the acronym in Spanish is FAFG. It's a site of exhumations, a place where bodies have been found, are being exhumed, that is, are being taken from the earth. And what you see on the right-hand upper screen is what's called an ossuary, or a big pit, where thousands and thousands of people had been thrown after they were killed. You see in the lower left-hand that these are some of the remains that have been taken out, and you see on the lower right that process of exhumation, where people who are not only the forensic anthropologists who are doing the excavations of these bodies, but also people who are waiting to see if perhaps visible remains of their loved ones, as they might identify them with clothing and other artifacts, can be found. At FAFG, it was really just chilling to us to see the work that was being done. And the upper left picture, someone is wearing a lot of clothing that is protective. And the reason is that some of these remains still have soft tissue on them. And because of the process of decomposition, there can be bacteria that can be harmful to the anthropologist doing the work. The woman at the right, of course, is investigating the skulls, the remains, and doing the cataloging. Clyde Snow, an American forensic anthropologist, went to Guatemala with experts, and these experts were largely coming from Argentina, where similar forensic examinations had been done to determine what had happened during Argentina's war from 1976 to 1983. A total of 3 ossuaries in Guatemala have been opened, with a total of more than 12,000 bodies. We then went to a place called Femdegua, and these two very brave women are the founders of Femdegua. Blanca on the left, Aurora Aura Elena on the right, both had loved ones who disappeared. Blanca's son was a firefighter. He was involved in some of the resistance groups, and he simply disappeared one day, and Blanca has never been able to find out the truth of what happened to him. Aurora Elena's brother disappeared. Blanca lost 6 family members during the genocide. FEMDEGWA started in 1984, and the purpose was to try to find information. It began as a support group, looking for family members who might still be in jail, who might be in morgues, who ultimately perhaps would be found as processes of exhumation would begin. These are some of the pictures on the wall at FEMDEGWA's office, and I call your attention in particular to the picture of the young woman on the bottom row of photographs. Men and women were disappeared. FEMDEGWA has identified 1,288 people so far. Some of those who were disappeared were children. They were taken and then virtually enslaved by people who were in the military. The story of one of them, Oscar, appeared on National Public Radio. The effort now on the part of FEMDEGWA is to try to get prison time for these perpetrators. Here you see Rachel and I with one of the adult survivors of a massacre in a place called Rio Negro. His name is Jesus Teco Osario, and he's written a book, and he's the subject of a documentary about the genocide. He was one of the first to break the silence of this tragedy in Guatemala, along with some women. 3 of the perpetrators have been found guilty and given prison sentences, but they were low-level civil patrols, as they're called. These were people who were usually taken from the Mayan community, who were Mayan, and who were forced by the army to help support the army's vicious efforts at extermination. So this created tension and fear, and of course in the aftermath of the genocide, people who had been in the civil patrol are back in their own communities, living next door to families perhaps whose loved ones they may have killed. Carlos Chen, in this picture, is another adult survivor of Rio Negro. His entire family was killed, and he helped to create a settlement for survivors outside of the town of Rabanal called Pakesh. He's been working now for years and years to try to get some reparations money. The next series of slides are from that place of massacre called Rio Negro, and at a distance it looks beautiful, high in the hills in Guatemala. Here at Rio Negro, the men were first rounded up, and they were taken away and they were slaughtered. And then about 117 women and children were marched about 5 kilometers up into the mountain. Some had their heads chopped off. Children were flung against the trees until they were killed, and so on. The massacres at Rio Negro were the massacres that inspired the first exhumations, and it took enormous courage for the people to do this. This is a memorial site at Rio Negro on that mountainside. This is a plaque that highlights names of boys and girls, women and men who have been killed. Another memorial picture. At Rio Negro, we spent the night, and you see us having a meal in the community, the women sharing handicrafts that were available for sale as a way to begin to earn some income. We visited cemeteries, and outside of the cemeteries again, there are pictures of more of the disappeareds. One of the issues that we looked at as well was the issue of what was happening with the mines in this area, because the land of the Mayans is being desecrated for this. Women are very involved in the anti-mining movement. And here you see some of the women at a protest against the mines that are coming in from Canada and the United States. The situation for women is particularly difficult. The violence that was perpetrated during the genocide continues to affect the communities. The situation for children also is particularly horrific. Half of Guatemala's children are malnourished. And the long-term impact, as we know, of malnutrition plays out in education and in virtually every kind of life choice that people will confront. The woman on the left is named Claudia Pazzi Paz, a very brave woman who is one of the leading prosecutors in Guatemala today. And she has been advocating to end the impunity of those who perpetrated the massacres. Efrain Rios Montt was one of the leaders of the genocide and now is in prison. So briefly, what has happened is the legacy meant that there was the utter destruction of the rule of law, ongoing racism and separation of the groups, increasing economic control by the ruling elite, certainly a brain drain as those who could flee did so, more than 1 million of the 14 million people. And the country now is truly struggling desperately to rebuild. And I'll welcome your comments and your questions.
Well, my goodness, first of all, I have to say just how eye-opening and really moving these photos are and the story of what goes on in the world. And
Thank you.
My goodness, Ellen, can you maybe just start, just maybe for some of our viewers out there, just the topic of genocide. What is it? What do we mean by it?
Excellent question.
Let's start there. And
Excellent question. The word genocide didn't exist until after the Holocaust. There was no such word. And there was a Jewish refugee from Poland named Raphael Lemkin. Lemkin fled from Poland, came to the United States during the Holocaust, tried desperately to bring his family here, and was unable to do so. And he lost 46 family members to the ovens in Auschwitz. He felt there had to be a word for the effort to exterminate not just people, but a group of people based on their identity. He created the word genocide. Geno from the Greek meaning group or tribe, and then side, of course, as we know, meaning killing, as in suicide, homicide. So genocide means the killing of a group of people based on who they are. And he was the one who wrote the Genocide Convention that was passed by the United Nations after the Holocaust in 1948, making it a crime to try to exterminate a group of people based on race, ethnicity, religion, or national origin.
Okay, thank you. That was really helpful.
Yeah.
I think the other thing, the dates you gave, 1960
Yes.
to
1996.
So I just want to point that out because I think of particular significance when we hear of genocide. As a society, I think it's easy to say, "Oh, that happened years ago. That was something we don't do that. You know, we wouldn't allow that anymore." But my goodness, 96. That wasn't too long ago.
That's right.
So
Well, and what a long period of 36
Yes.
years,
Yes.
and now
Yes.
That
I
too.
forgot the math of how many years later. I mean, it's the breadth of that as well as the
Exactly.
depth.
Exactly.
How do you recover from having hundreds of thousands of people
That's
killed or
right.
disappeared?
Exactly.
just
Last
incredible.
summer, I came back from a trip to a place called East Timor, an island nation in the South Pacific. A genocide was perpetrated there from 1975 to 1999, and almost the same number of people perished. Now think about Europe. We think about the Holocaust, and we know that happened in the 1940s. But what a lot of people forget is that there was a genocide back in Eastern Europe, back in Bosnia, in the 1990s. So in a place where the world said never again, genocide happened yet again.
Yes.
Well, and I'm very much thinking about the Arab Spring, too, and what's happening in Syria and
And
Libya,
Darfur.
and, I mean, it is sadly not very uncommon.
No,
And
it's not.
it seems like the world hasn't learned very many lessons.
That's right.
I would love to hear more about first of all, how did it all come out? What is the government of Guatemala like now, knowing that, Cold War for many of us is long over.
That's right.
And I think just that whole issue of the role of the United States, how can somebody like me living on the east side of St. Paul even begin to comprehend something that happened so far away? And yet it is. I know it's on my block.
That's
You know,
right.
the immigrants
right.
from there, the way our country funds those governments.
Yes.
So that's a big question, but, you know, can you comment on those linkages and the
Absolutely.
current status of the political system there?
Well, I think it's a very important question, Bonnie, because the United States government during the Cold War did help to support the dictatorial government in Chile and in Guatemala and in Honduras and in Argentina as part of the way of keeping communism out. And of course, why was communism such a threat? Because it was a threat to the economic system of capitalism. And we know that power and economics are allied like this. So what can we do as ordinary citizens? Well, I think it really is important for us to be aware of these bigger geopolitical issues. We have an election coming up in November. What are the foreign policy issues? How do we make informed choices? What information do we indeed have? And it's important for us to take a very critical look at who the people are who are suffering and who are being manipulated in order to ensure that certain economic and political policies might prevail at great human cost. I think that's really critical. We can begin in our own backyard. We know that there are many efforts today to stigmatize and demonize recent immigrants. So I think it helps to understand the conditions from which they have fled and to truly work on policies that can integrate them fully and fairly into life in Minnesota and life in the United States.
But that's why, Ellen, you're saying why votes matter. Is that what I'm
Absolutely.
hearing? I want to really point
Absolutely.
that out because I think
Yes.
that people think, well, how can I make a difference? It does matter, and it does make a difference.
It makes a difference from the local to the global.
Yeah.
Before we started airing today's show, we were talking about how complicated these global issues are, and in some ways how removed they feel from us. But they're not. An issue like the violence against women is really important for us to think about because even though it happens in places like Guatemala, it happens here as well. If we tolerate violence against women in St. Paul and Edina and Bloomington, and we know that we tolerate it, then of course we're going to tolerate it when it happens on such a huge scale around the world. We have to end impunity for these injustices here first for many of us.
I think what I find mesmerizing is how can countries, turn against themselves? They just really break themselves apart themselves.
right.
Because I had done a report on Tunisia, and it all started with, just a local farmer setting himself on fire as a form of protest to the dictator Ben Ali. And it was because of that dictator that the entire country fell apart, and then the Arab Spring sprung from that. And to just see that, how can genocides start from things like that? Dictators that were completely oblivious to what the people were wanting and what was happening to the people, and how it was really the country's fault itself. They make themselves fall apart. And how is it that we can stop that? How can genocides be prevented from things like that?
I think you've raised many important points, and the first that I want to say something about is that people become dehumanized. They're not seen as people anymore. They're seen merely as objects, and they become painted with a very negative brush, so that exterminating them is not the killing of people. It's the killing of something that's viewed as harming the body politic in some way. So we have to watch our language. We have to watch how we treat people in our own communities first and foremost. And then what can we do about it? A recent poll that was just done a few weeks ago showed that 69% of the American public feels that genocide needs to be prevented. How do we do that? Well, there are many efforts to look at warning signals for genocide. We know tragically that Kofi Annan from the United Nations, who was the representative for trying to negotiate an end to the conflict in Syria, has simply thrown his hands up and said, I cannot do this. And he has stepped aside from that role because because he's not able to get all the players on the Security Council at the United Nations together. So how do we, ordinary citizens, begin to do this? We have to advocate. We have to advocate not only here in the United States, but with our fellow human beings, our brothers and sisters around the world, to get them to advocate with their elected officials, with their representatives at the United Nations. Genocides happen for many complicated reasons, but they also happen for a simple reason. We let them happen.
Right.
And it's up to each of us to contact our own elected officials, from the local to the global, because that way we can make a difference. Your question is great.
And, you know, how do we stop that abuse of power, you know, with totalitarian governments? And that's where a lot of genocides have started, because of a person abusing their powers either as a dictator or as a totalitarian government.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
I knew that makes me think, I know we're running out of time, but the women angle, you know,
Yes.
do women have a different attitude towards power, or will we be just as abusive when we get the chance? Or, you know, could you just comment on the women aspect of this?
I'm really hopeful, because I mentioned the role of the women who started FEMDEGWA.
Yes.
I have been in touch with women from around the world who are doing similar things. The women of Srebrenica, who've organized the exhumations and identifications after the Srebrenica massacre in Bosnia. Women in Argentina, the Madres, who've demonstrated now since 1976 on the plaza in Buenos Aires, Argentina. Women around the world truly are the ones who are advocating for rights, for humanity, for dignity for all people. So I do believe that we women are the cornerstone of the future for human rights.
And I think a lot of people are seeing that too. You know, they want women getting into the political side. You know, they want more women either with representatives or senators or even as a president one day maybe, you know, because they feel that a woman being up there might help raise the views of a lot more people and bring up different viewpoints.
Absolutely.
And I think that is true, that'll bring a different stepping stone for...
And women like you are the hope of the future.
That's right.
Truly, truly the hope of the future. And I hope that there are young women watching who understand that every one of you has a voice. And it's only through engaging with the next generation that the future can be brighter than the past.
Excellent. Well, Ellen, thank you so much for being with us today. You know, the time went so quickly, but this is a very important subject. It's something that I think each one of us can do something about and make a difference. And so I hope our viewers who are watching us today hear that message loud and clear. But I must ask you, Ellen, we need to have you come back, because we need to talk a little bit more. I'd like to hear, as we went through the pictures, I want to hear a little bit more about the stories of those survivors. And I think that's really poignant and very important for us to understand how they get back into the game of life and what makes them go on. So, Ellen, we'll be seeing you shortly.
Thank you. It would be an honor.
All right. And Anu, thank you so much for being with us today.
It's great to
be here. And Bonnie, same to you. It's been a wonderful show. And I thank you for being with us today on It's a Woman's World, and we hope to see you next time.